But in the main, they believed that euthanasia would not achieve what they wanted to achieve. And so instead, they opted for forced surgical sterilization. And they got it. They obtained legislation in 27 states that forcibly sterilized some 60,000 Americans. In addition to forced surgical sterilization, there was marriage restriction, marriage annulment. If they didn't like who you were married, they unmarried you. And of course, there was the effort to create concentration camps, which they called farms or colonies, for those who were feeble-minded, so-called feeble-minded, or racially unacceptable. They started out by calling these colonies for the feeble-minded. There were several in New Jersey, in Massachusetts, and eventually hundreds of thousands of individuals were incarcerated and then forcibly sterilized because they were deemed to be unfit. Now, what kind of people are we talking about who are unfit? We're talking about Southern Italians. We're talking about Eastern European Jews. We're talking about blacks, Indians. We're talking about Asians. And we're talking about white guys with brown hair. They believed that white guys with brown hair, the hillbillies, the hill folk, many of which were in these parts of Tennessee, were basically bastardizations and mongrelizations of the white Nordic ideal that they lionized. In fact, the state of Virginia published a booklet entitled Mongrel Virginians about these mongrel human beings. And they came up with a number of ideas on how to identify these people. And one of them was the alpha test and the beta test. It was a mental measurement test. And this mental measurement test might ask a Southern Italian who knew every opera and aria about a Broadway musical. He'd come into Ellis Island, they'd ask him a question about Broadway musicals. You might get a black guy from the farm who had never been to a big city, and they would ask him something about a cosmopolitan magazine. You might get a Baptist kid from rural America who would, of course, never smoked. They'd ask them about tobacco ads. They would ask people about tennis rackets who didn't even know what tennis was. And by this methodology, they were able to conclude that 70 to 80% of the Jews were morons, 70 to 80% of the blacks were morons, and these people were worthy of sterilization so that they could not perpetuate their kind. This test, the alpha and beta test, was ultimately evolved into something we know today as the IQ test. It's the same basic test, but it's evolved. Now, there were so many things that were upside down about this. The ophthalmologists of America, if you can possibly believe this, went on a national crusade to identify everybody with a vision problem, find their entire family, round them up, put them in concentration camps, and forcibly sterilize them as a way to improve vision in America. There's a whole chapter about that. They actually took the first step with a bill entered into the New York legislature, although this bill was defeated. Although these laws were in 27 states, there were many people who felt that this was unconstitutional, and so there was a kind of a go slow approach. And so a fraudulent collusive lawsuit was created in Virginia for the purpose of making eugenics a test case. The state of Virginia wanted to sterilize the mother, the daughter, and the granddaughter of one family. It was a famous case, Carrie Buck, her mother, and her daughter. So the state of Virginia colluded with the court-appointed attorneys for Carrie Buck and wound a fraudulent appeal right up through the Supreme Court. And Oliver Wendell Holmes, who was a staunch eugenicist, ruled for the majority that it is better for all the world, that's a quote, that these 3 generations be sterilized. Quote, 3 generations of imbeciles are enough. And in so doing, opened the floodgates. And ultimately, as I said, some 60,000 Americans were forcibly sterilized, many without even knowing it. Some, they said, were voluntarily sterilized. They would get some girl from the hills of Virginia or Kentucky or Tennessee, and they would ask her, hi, honey, do do you like the movies? Do you like the cartoons? She'd say, yeah, I do. Do you mind if we do something to help out your health? She'd say, sure. And they say, fine, voluntary sterilization. Ultimately, this was not only national policy enshrined in legislation in 27 states, it became the law of the land. And backing it up was fake science and fake academics from the highest corridors of Harvard, Yale, Stanford, and Princeton. It was the greatest of our universities that provided the sham science to back up these racists. Now, just so you understand, we are not talking about a bunch of guys running around a pickup truck with a Confederate flag behind them and a gun rack in the back window. We're talking about the brightest and the best, the elite, about the greatest America had to offer. And all these laws were endorsed and debated by 27 legislatures in 27 states. This was not an isolated matter. This was not a matter that never went into to implementation. It was a national attempt to engage in ethnic cleansing, and it was supported by corporate philanthropy. Now, it wasn't enough to do this in the United States. These guys, the American Eugenics movement, wanted to do this worldwide. And so the Carnegie Institution began to sponsor pseudoscientific medical journals, international congresses, and research fellowships around the world, especially in Europe, to proliferate our ideas into other countries. And we did this successfully, getting cohorts of American Eugenics to sponsor legislation in Canada, in Belgium, in Scandinavia, and a particular pet project of the American Eugenics movement was Germany.